Hi, my name is Evan Griffin. For my video on working animals, I will be doing a presentation on dogs and primates that were launched into outer space during the 20th century. Before I start, I'd like to clarify that there have been many different types of animals to be sent into space as early as the 1940s and as recent as this decade. This has included a long list including invertebrates like fruit flies and arachnids, mice, rats, rabbits, tortoises, octopuses, and the list goes on. However, I don't believe that these animals qualify as working animals, as we've learned about in class, because they were not trained to perform any specific tasks or withstand any specific conditions, like dogs and primates that I will discuss were. For the first section, I'll be discussing how this came to be, and why and when. So for a bit of historical context, in the 1940s, the Cold War began between the United States and the Soviet Union. They both competed in what's known as the space race, where they both competed to extend their sphere of influence off into space and eventually reach the moon, because they wanted to compete with each other politically. But in the 1940s, around the time NASA was formed, very few people understood what going into space would do to a person's mind or body. So scientists decided to begin with animal subjects by launching them into space and then studying everything from their behavior to their brain activity to their metabolism while they were in a lower gravity environment. The United States primarily focused on primates because they possessed physiology similar to humans. In 1949, NASA sent the first mammal, a rhesus monkey named Albert II, pictured on the left, into space, though unfortunately he died when his capsule's parachute failed to open. NASA sent several other rhesus macaques and squirrel monkeys, some of whom did not come back alive, into suborbital space. And then in 1961, they sent a chimpanzee named Ham, the first gray ape, into suborbital space. And then later that year, also a chimp named Enos into Earth's orbit, which is a deeper part of space than where Ham went. And both chimps made it back alive. The Soviet Union, in contrast, chose to use dogs primarily, mainly because they were readily available to scientists, and also because they considered them easier to train and better able to withstand pressure and stress than monkeys and chimps. So throughout the 1950s, they did several suborbital flights, but in 1957, the Soviets sent the first mammal into Earth's orbit on the satellite Sputnik 2. And this was a dog named Laika on the left there. She was a 4-year-old stray dog in Moscow who was picked up by scientists and launched into space, and she became a prominent symbol of propaganda for many years after. And she also, unfortunately, did not survive her mission. She died of heat exposure because the capsule's cooling system failed, although the government would claim for many years that she died from oxygen loss. In 1960, they sent a pair of dogs, Belka and Strelka, on Sputnik 5, and they were the first animals to go into Earth's orbit and return back alive. And eventually, both nations sort of lost interest in animals in favor of sending people, like Yuri Gagarin, the first person in space, and John Glenn, the first American in Earth's orbit. So the second section, I will be discussing why I and many of you perhaps would consider these animals working animals. So because the scientists wanted to, succeed in sending them into space, the training they went through was pretty rigorous. For the dogs, they were mostly trained to be habituated to small spaces and confinement so that they could be in the capsules and also the suits that they wore for oxygen and excretion. And the way they were trained for this was that they were basically just kept in very small cages for all of their time, increasingly, and they got increasingly smaller so that they would supposedly be less stressed once they were in the capsules. And they were also spun around in centrifuges so that they could experience high velocity speeds and loud sounds that would cross over to being launched into space. And for the primates, especially the chimps, they were trained to perform small, simple tasks that human astronauts would need to perform in lower gravity. The chimps, Ham and Enos, were trained to pull levers in certain sequences to turn on lights. And whenever they would do something right, they would be banana pellets. And when they did something wrong, they would receive electric jolts. And when they were once they were in before they were sent to space, the dogs and the primates had implants and monitors put on them in order for the scientists to check their vital signs while they were in space, like heart rate, blood pressure, and breathing, and also monitor the sort of actions they performed. And for the third section, I would like to discuss kind of the many glaring ethical problems with these missions and how these animals were treated. Nowadays, we understand that things like confinement and all the unnecessary pain and discomfort were directly in conflict with the basic welfare needs of many species of animals, including dogs and primates. And and they died, obviously, from the missions, either from crashes or explosions or extreme temperatures, and this is also very problematic. And of course, not all animals died, but nowadays, um, it's for all we know, the animals that did survive might not have had it much better than the animals who didn't. For many years, scientists didn't believe animals could really feel emotions or suffer mental health issues. It's still kind of a new idea, but nowadays we understand things that are harmful to people are harmful to animals, like loud noises can be linked to pain in dogs because a lot of them are sensitive to noises, and chimpanzees can suffer PTSD after suffering traumatic experiences, such as being launched into space at very high speeds with loud noises. This was all done before things like the AWA ensured rights for animals on a federal level. So these missions might not be possible today. And even back then, people could tell there were issues with these actions. One Soviet scientist named Oleg Gazenko, who was involved with Laika's mission, was quoted as saying, "The more time passes, the more I'm sorry about it. We shouldn't have done it. We did not learn enough from this mission to justify the death of the dog." Sending animals into space was primarily motivated by politics. The United States and the Soviet Union wanted to get to the moon as quickly as possible, So they didn't care all that much about the lives of animals if it meant making that happen. They wanted to make sure people's lives were preserved. Um, but um, but how despite all that, there was useful information that came out of these animal missions. Because of the monitors that were on Laika, Soviet scientists could tell that once she was in orbit, her vital signs like her heart rate and breathing returned to normal, which proved that it was possible for people to be launched into space and not die. And this was what paved the way for many future astronauts like Yuri Gagarin and John Glenn, and eventually even the Apollo 11 moon landing, all of which had major scientific, political, and cultural impacts. So the question I ask of you is, do you think these achievements were worth the deaths and endangerments of these dogs and primates?